The first warning didn't come with thunder or gunshots, it came with the wind. He descended from the frozen plains as if he had a life of his own, piercing through uniforms, tearing blankets, biting faces, ears and souls. For those on the front lines, it was as if an invisible knife was trying to rip the skin from the bones. Within hours, lakes began to freeze, and the earth, hard as concrete, trapped each step in the ground. German soldiers, accustomed to rapid and meteorological advances, looked around in disbelief. The season should have been short, mild, almost symbolic. That's what their commanders said. But they were completely wrong. The Soviet winter arrived like a raging beast. First came the fine snow, covering the battlefield like an illusory, almost beautiful white sheet. But soon it turned into a storm, a wall of ice and wind that hid the horizon and erased entire trails. Men walked with their heads down, feeling their eyelashes freeze, their beards fill with crystals, and their fingers burn until they went numb. The cold was so intense that it burned before it froze. With each breath, white clouds escaped the soldiers' mouths, as if life itself were trying to escape through them. Metal weapons clung to their skin. Anyone who touched metal without gloves risked leaving bits of flesh on the iron. Boots hardened, mud turned to stone, and the familiar sounds of war, gunfire, engines, roaring tanks, began to fade, muffled by layer upon layer of snow. Soviets and Germans felt the same shock. Winter didn't choose sides. To it, everyone was a stranger invading its frozen territory. Some soldiers tried to dig trenches, only to realize that the ground wouldn't give way. The shovel hit the ground and made a clang deafening, as if striking a sealed tomb. No one could sleep, not because there was gunfire, but because if they closed their eyes for too long, they might simply not wake up, frozen, stiff as ice statues at dawn. And so, before any battalion clashed, before the steel of the tanks crossed the fields, the first great enemy appeared, silent, cruel, immense, the winter that nobody expected. The German advance had seemed unstoppable just a few weeks earlier. Tanks crossed borders, cities fell at an alarming rate, and the Luftwaffe dominated the skies like birds of prey. Hitler's war machine raced at high speed toward Moscow, pushing everything in its path. But what the generals didn't know, what no map or weather report could predict, was that the greatest obstacle was about to crush this perfect machine, the weather itself. The winter storm intensified, and with it came a second enemy, invisible and relentless. Gasoline thickened inside the tanks. Burnt oil turned to solid paste. Engines stuttered, coughed, and died with dry sounds, as if suffocated. The tanks that once roared for miles now became immobile blocks of metal stuck to the white, frozen ground. Soldiers tried to turn cranks, bang on the engines, rekindle the life of the machines, but it was useless. Everything was too cold to function. The cold even affected strategy. Blitzkrieg depended on speed, surprise, and the ability to move before the enemy could react. But as the wheels stopped and the tank tracks sank into knee-deep snow, that speed evaporated. The columns stalled. The offensive was stuck. The weather, which had always worked in the Germans' favor, became a traitor. The Soviets watched from afar and understood exactly what was happening. They had known. This silent enemy for generations. It wasn't the first time the Russian winter had defeated invaders. Napoleon had learned this the hard way. Now the Wehrmacht would learn it too. German officers began to realize the disaster that was brewing. Uniforms that were too light, prepared for a quick summer campaign, were useless in temperatures that dropped below 30 degrees below zero. Boots cracked. Soldiers wrapped their feet in newspapers, cloths, anything that could warm them. Even so, they froze on the march. And then the advance turned into an exhausted, slow, crooked line. Men pushed tanks with their bare hands, cursing, swearing, shouting orders cut off by the wind and snow. It seemed absurd, machines weighing tens of tons, pushed by humans already at the limit of their endurance. In this scenario, the Blitzkrieg, which had once been a lightning bolt, had become just a weak flame about to go out. Every kilometer gained cost lives, fingers, painful breaths, and the certainty that the greatest enemy did not wear a red uniform, but a white one. The German advance had frozen, literally and spiritually. In the midst of the snow and the biting silence, the Wehrmacht realized it was trapped on a battlefield it didn't understand, and the winter clock kept ticking mercilessly. The cold began as an annoyance, then turned into pain, and finally transformed into something more terrifying. A constant, invisible presence that seemed to want to devour every man still alive on that front. It didn't matter which side of the uniform they wore. Germans and Soviets faced an enemy that could not be targeted, bombed, or surrounded. Winter. At first, the soldiers tried to endure. They clenched their teeth, hunched their shoulders, rubbed their hands, took deep breaths and kept marching. But the human body has limits, and the Russian winter respects none of them. The freezing air was so dry it felt like it was entering their nostrils and tearing their throats from the inside. Each breath felt smoky, as if pieces of lung were escaping along with the hot vapor. The men tried to speak, but their voices vanished. Their tongues stuck to the roof of their mouths, and the cold stole even the will to open their lips. The exposed skin didn't take long to break. A face that had been exposed to the wind for just a few minutes could wake up with purple and black marks, early signs of frostbite, fingers and toes burning as if on fire, and then going numb. This numbness was the real danger. When the pain subsided, it was a sign that the body had given up trying to save that part. Many tried to improvise protection. Cloths, bags, newspapers, pieces of leather, anything that would serve as a barrier against the White Death. Even so, men woke up unable to feel their feet. Some only realized the gravity of the situation when they pulled at their boots and saw their toes blackened like burnt wood. Some pretended not to see, just to keep marching, until their toes literally fell off. The weapons also suffered. Metals froze and stuck to the skin like sharp bites. Anyone who touched a rifle without gloves could tear off chunks of flesh. The oil in the gears hardened, rendering rifles unusable when they were most needed. Soldiers spent hours rubbing weapons against their chests to warm them up while trembling uncontrollably. And then there was the night terror. As evening fell, the cold became almost supernatural. Makeshift camps sprang up in ruins, ditches, or small clearings, but nothing seemed enough. Men huddled side by side, sharing warmth like cornered animals, shivering to the bone. Some fell asleep exhausted and simply never woke up again, found at dawn, sitting with their eyes open, as if merely reflecting on the war, when in reality the cold had hijacked their lives during their sleep. What was once a proud, confident, and fierce army had become something different. Rows of shadows staggering through the snow, battling the weather before even facing any human enemy. They knew that with every hour spent in that white hell, someone nearby wouldn't survive. There, in that icy vastness, a bloody truth imposed itself. Men were at war, not only with each other, but with nature itself. And she, cold and silent, was unwilling to yield. After months of traversing forests, frozen swamps, and burned-out cities, the German soldiers could finally glimpse what their commanders had promised from the beginning, the distant silhouette of Moscow. For many men, it seemed like the end of the journey, the final blow that would decide the war in the east. One more push, the officer said. Victory is right there, behind that curtain of snow. But Moscow was not just a point on the map. It was a giant, surrounded by defenses, men, and above all, time. Time that was now working against the invaders. On days when the sky cleared and the wind allowed them to see beyond a few meters, the soldiers could see the smoke from the chimneys, the dim light of the houses, and dreamed of the warmth that might exist behind those invisible walls. They were so close that some believed they could hear, in the frozen silence, the distant echo of the living city. It was like seeing an oasis in the desert, too close to doubt, too far to touch. But the terrain between them and the capital was treacherous. Every kilometer was contested as if it were gold, and Moscow seemed to recede every time a battalion took a step. The roads were covered in ice and snow so deep that the wheels of the trucks sank as if trying to cross quicksand. Makeshift Soviet trenches sprang up where, hours before, there had only been silence. And just behind the lines, new soldiers arrived en masse, as if the Russian soil were spitting out defenders. The Luftwaffe, once a hammer that broke through any resistance, now faced storms that prevented even the shortest flight. Planes froze on the ground, and when they managed to take off, visibility was so low that bombing positions was more a gamble than precision. Down below, soldiers wondered where that protective sky, which had once seemed invincible, had gone. Meanwhile, the Soviets were gaining confidence. The mere fact that Moscow was still standing was already a psychological blow to the invaders. Propaganda, loudspeakers, and rumors traveled faster than bullets. The city resists. Ref, 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 said the leaflets thrown into the icy wind. For the Germans, this news was like stabs in the ribs, piercing the rigidity of their frozen uniforms. Each battle around the capital was brutal and relentless. Isolated houses became fortresses, burned warehouses turned into firing points. Narrow, frozen streets were stained red after silent ambushes. The hope of a swift capture vanished like the warmth of a solitary campfire in the middle of the night. And then came the hardest truth of all. The advance had stalled. Moscow was in sight, yes, but unreachable. There wasn't enough strength, enough fuel, enough shelter, or enough time. One more step seemed to cost 10 lives. The promise of victory had turned into a burden on the shoulders of every soldier. There stood the city that would decide the fate of the campaign, close enough to imagine oneself inside, but protected by something more powerful than walls and soldiers, by winter, by delay, and by the resistance of a people who would not accept defeat. For a moment, fate seemed to be balanced on the tip of a frozen bayonet. But that balance would soon be broken, and not in favor of the invaders. At a certain point, it became clear to every German soldier on the front. The war would not be won with courage and bullets alone. Fuel, food, ammunition, medicine, winter clothing were needed. Everything that had seemed trivial at the beginning of the campaign now became a matter of life or death. And it was precisely at this point that winter struck with its greatest ferocity. The roads the Germans had used to advance rapidly during the warmer months were now unrecognizable. Waves of frozen mud, invisible potholes, blizzards that erased any geographical reference. It was as if the ground were trying to swallow them whole. Trucks got stuck, horses slipped and broke their legs, and entire convoys disappeared in the snow before reaching their destination. One day, troops would hear that resupply would arrive at dawn. The next, they would discover it had been lost miles away, seized by the Soviets, or simply swallowed by the cold. Without gasoline to heat engines or power tanks, German steel turned to frozen statues. Soldiers used the little fuel that remained to light fires that barely warmed their fingers. Officers shouted orders to conserve ammunition, and the dry echo of these orders bounced off the snow and returned empty, as if the terrain itself were mocking the army that had believed itself marching invincible through Russia. The food ran out first. However, it didn't disappear completely. It became increasingly scarce until it turned into an object of internal dispute. Men fought over breadcrumbs. They fought over dented cans of preserves. Some killed horses to survive, and after a few days, there were no horses left to kill. What once seemed unthinkable became routine. Soldiers fought over frozen food, hard as stone, which had to be broken open with bayonets to be consumed. In the medical field, the scenario was even more cruel. Wounded patients who, in the summer, would have been easily saved now died silently because the bandages froze the instant they touched the skin. The few antibiotics that existed turned to crystals inside the bottles. Doctors improvised impossible treatments, wrapping wounds with torn cloths, hoping that gangrene would not spread. While the Germans suffered, the Red Army, though also wounded by the cold, was fueled by a decisive advantage: distance. The Soviet lines shortened as the enemy advanced. Moscow was close to them, and from there locomotives, winter-hardened trucks, and rested troops departed directly from the depths of the country. For the Russians, each day of enemy delay was a life saved. For the Germans, it was a step towards collapse. What had begun as a victorious march had turned into a desperate dependence on resources that never arrived. It was an invisible and silent war, fought long before the first shot was fired in the morning. Each lost train, each wagon that didn't arrive, was like an amputated limb of the army, dragging itself towards Moscow. And as the cold tightened its grip and supplies dwindled, the soldiers realized with growing horror that the battle was being fought far from the minefields and trenches. It was being fought between frozen railroads, buried roads, and empty depots. The war of movement was over. In its place, a war of survival was emerging, and in it, Germany was beginning to lose even before it realized it. Until that moment, many German soldiers harbored the illusion that the Soviets were finished. They had retreated for weeks, abandoned cities, destroyed roads, burned everything that could be useful to the enemy. For the Nazis, it seemed that victory was only a matter of time. But while they advanced and froze in the snow, something silent was happening behind the red lines. The Soviet army was learning. At the beginning of the war, the Russians had been caught off guard. Borders crumbled. Entire divisions were surrounded and destroyed before they even knew what was happening. But the terror of the summer turned into discipline in the winter. Surviving officers reorganized their men, scattered units regrouped, and what had once been chaos began to take shape. Each abandoned village, each road covered in ice, became a classroom. Soldiers learned to use winter as a weapon, not as an enemy. They found shelter, camouflage, and advantage in the snow. While the Germans shivered in thin uniforms, the Soviets distributed thick coats and lined boots. While the invaders struggled with jammed weapons, the Russians used special oil for low temperatures, keeping rifles ready to fire at any moment. In the frozen trenches, Soviet commanders whispered to each soldier what they needed to do: not confront the enemy head-on, but wear them down, attack when they were weakest. Silent ambushes sprang up along the frozen roads. Small groups, almost invisible in the storm, attacked German depots, captured prisoners, destroyed fuel, and severed communication cables. Each assault stole what the Germans needed most: time, supplies, peace of mind. The strategy changed completely. The Red Army, which had previously fled, began to choose where to fight. They established defensive positions at key points, ceded ground when necessary, and counterattacked when the enemy was exhausted. This new form of combat left the invaders confused and angry. Each captured village seemed empty, but at night gunshots emerged like ghosts, coming from houses buried in the snow. Meanwhile, the Soviets were rebuilding their own forces. Distant factories, protected in the Ural Mountains, produced tanks, cannons, and ammunition non-stop. Women, teenagers, and even the elderly worked day and night on makeshift assembly lines. The Soviet industrial machine, which many believed destroyed, was more alive than ever. At the same time, Stalin reorganized his army with brutality and absolute focus. Traitors were executed, deserters disappeared, and the soldiers who remained developed an iron will. Morale was also changing. Propaganda began to do its work. Pamphlets, speeches, and radio broadcasts all transmitted the same message: we are not just fighting for flags, but for our homes, our families, our survival. This difference was profound. The Germans marched on orders, for glory or spoils. The Russians fought because they had nowhere else to run. The Soviet retreat, which had previously seemed like weakness, now revealed its true nature. It was preparation. The Red Army, hardened by its initial failure, returned to the front with greater discipline, better equipment, and the deadly advantage of familiarity with the terrain. They had bled in the summer, but in the winter they were ready to return every drop. And so, when the German lines were already stretched, frozen, and starving, the Red Army finally straightened up. The giant that had fallen stumbling now rose, and when it raised its face to face the enemy again, the Germans finally understood that this war would be much longer and harder than any general had predicted. Just when the Wehrmacht was beginning to believe that nothing worse could happen, something moved on the white horizon. It wasn't tanks, it wasn't planes, it was men. And they came from the deepest ice of the Soviet Union. The Siberian troops had arrived. These soldiers were not like those the Germans had faced in the summer. They didn't shiver in the cold, they didn't complain, and they didn't move slowly. They came from regions where winter wasn't a punishment, but a part of life. Children in Siberia learned to ski before they could even walk properly. Teenagers hunted in frozen forests with temperatures that would leave a Berliner paralyzed. For them, that frozen front wasn't the enemy. It was home. When they disembarked from the crowded trains arriving in Moscow, the difference was striking. While many Germans shivered in uniforms that resembled autumn clothes, the Siberians wore fur-lined coats, thick boots, and layers of fabric that seemed impenetrable to the cold. And even more importantly, they were rested. They had been kept away from the war until the right moment, protected from the wear and tear that was already consuming the invaders. In the Ural Mountains, Soviet generals had waited patiently. They knew that if they released the Siberians too soon, they would get lost in the initial chaos of the invasion. But now, with the Germans weakened, frozen, and trapped miles from their bases, the time had come. These troops moved like ghosts. While the snow made every step difficult for the Germans, the Siberians glided on skis, crossing forests in absolute silence, appearing and disappearing among the trees like shadows. Sometimes German observers swore they had seen figures moving on the horizon, but seconds later they found nothing. It was as if winter itself had gained soldiers. The initial fighting was swift, violent, and deeply demoralizing for the Wehrmacht. In isolated villages, small German units were attacked by groups that appeared out of nowhere, fired with deadly accuracy, and vanished before anyone could react. An entire detachment could become a statistic in minutes, buried under a storm of gunfire and ice. The Siberians' efficiency stemmed not only from the climate, but from their mentality. They knew why they were fighting. For many, Moscow was distant, but the meaning of the war was personal, protecting the country against an enemy that left nothing alive behind. This conviction gave strength to the hands that held rifles and courage to the feet that trod snow-covered paths. Soviet artillery and tanks began to accompany the attacks. Even these vehicles seemed more at ease in the cold, equipped with fuels and lubricants that wouldn't freeze. While German engines coughed and died, the red cannons roared with increasing vigor, announcing something the Germans still didn't want to accept. The turning point was approaching. For the Germans, facing the Siberians was a psychological shock as violent as it was physical. These men appeared at the worst possible moment, when hope was scarce and the cold crushed any will to fight. Many German soldiers believed that winter was their worst enemy. Now they discovered that winter had human allies. And so, as the snow continued to fall, the fate of the German lines began to crumble. The advance on the capital had stalled. Now, for the first time since crossing the Soviet border, the Germans were pushed back. The arrival of the Siberians was a clear warning. Moscow would not fall without a fight. And more than that, the war in the east was far from over. When the calendar marked December and the cold seemed to have sunk its permanent claws into the earth, something finally broke the deadly silence of the white steppes. It wasn't the weary sound of German engines trying to start, nor the lament of soldiers frozen at dawn. It was the roar of an army that, after months of being beaten, was finally rising to fight back. In the early morning of December 5, 1941, before sunrise, Soviet forces launched a massive attack. It was no longer a handful of men trying to delay the enemy. It was the Red Army, reorganized, rearmed, and determined to expel the invaders who were at the gates of their capital. For the first time since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, The Russians dictated the pace of the battle. The attack began in the dark. The deep snow muffled the sound of boots and skis, making thousands of soldiers seem to appear out of nowhere. The instant the first troops moved, cannons that had remained silent for weeks broke through the frozen air with deafening explosions. Soviet artillery struck German positions with precision and devastating force. A storm of fire swept through shelters, frozen trenches, and makeshift concessions made by the Germans during the march. The already weakened defenders were caught in a complete state of shock. Some officers simply couldn't believe what they were seeing. They had been trained to expect the enemy to be freezing on the verge of collapse. Instead, they faced well-fed, warm, and organized men who knew every thicket, every hill, every curve of the terrain. Right behind the infantry, Soviet tanks advanced. They weren't gleaming machines like the dreaded Panzers, but robust T-34s with wide tracks designed to traverse snow and mud where German vehicles got bogged down and stalled. For the Wehrmacht soldiers, it was as if the frozen ground was being crushed by steel giants emerging from beneath the snow itself. The Germans tried to fight back. They fired artillery blindly, attempted to reorganize their lines, and called for reinforcements that simply didn't exist. But it was an unequal fight. Weakened, starving, and frozen men faced enemies who exuded vigor, confidence, and a fury accumulated over months of defeats and suffering. As the day wore on, the Soviet offensive gained momentum. Villages recently captured by the Germans were retaken in short, brutal battles. Bodies from both sides began to dot the white snow, staining the terrain a deep red. The contrast was grotesque and unforgettable. The winter, which already seemed cruel, was now a scene of widespread death. For many German soldiers, it felt like waking from one nightmare only to fall into an even worse one. They were no longer advancing. They were no longer winning. For the first time, they were running for their lives. And while the snow continued to fall, the Red Army advanced relentlessly, pushing back millions of men who, months before, had believed themselves invincible. The Soviet counterattack was not merely a change of military direction. It was the precise moment when the fate of the war began to turn slowly, like a huge ship that takes time to maneuver, but which, upon changing course, moves forward with unstoppable force. And the Germans, who had marched confidently towards Moscow, were now beginning to understand, with growing horror, that the long road ahead no longer led to victory, but to a humiliating return, filled with snow, blood, and despair. Gradually, the gunfire became less frequent, as if the exhausted battlefield was begging for a break. The rifle shots, once constant, became isolated, accompanied by the hollow echo that died among the skeletal trees. The Americans could finally breathe a little, even if the frigid air burned their lungs. For a few moments, many believed that this was the end of the German advance. A fatal miscalculation, for the scouts of the 82nd realized too late that the dark roads behind them were not merely covered in snow, they were being infiltrated. Groups of German soldiers, wearing white cloaks and advancing with an almost ghostly, silent discipline, began to emerge from among the tree trunks. There was no cry of warning, just a dry thud, then another and another. When chaos erupted again, it came like an avalanche. The Americans found themselves firing at shadows and shapes, unable to distinguish uniforms in the dark. Machine guns spun feverishly, searching for nothing. Some men retreated instinctively, stumbling and falling in the soft snow, while others, driven by pure instinct, advanced, screaming against an enemy they could barely see. The division general, a man who refused to warm his hands on a stove while his soldiers froze, watched the combat with his jaw clenched. He knew this was no ordinary attack, but rather the prelude to the maneuver Hitler so desired, to encircle, crush, and wipe out the 101st and 82nd Divisions as if they had never even existed. The radio, which had so often been a lifeline, began to fail. The batteries simply died in the cold. Messages became disjointed fragments, distant voices trying to reach invisible allies. Without communication, and with the German advance pressing on all flanks, the organized retreat turned into a desperate struggle for control of every crossroads. Exhausted gunners held positions until the last projectile, only to be forced to abandon frozen pieces that no longer responded to commands. Trucks got stuck in the snow, turning the roads into impenetrable bottlenecks. When dawn finally arrived, tinging the sky a deep grey, the survivors witnessed the full horror. The valley behind them pulsed with enemy movement. Entire columns of armor advanced, breaking branches, crushing fences, devouring scattered resistance. It was the kind of sight that froze the soul before it even froze the body. The German offensive was a hammer falling with full force, and the Americans were merely the nail trying not to bend. But even in that terrible moment, something unexpected happened. Determination, that silent fiber that emerges when there is no alternative, spread among the combatants. They knew they couldn't defeat the entire Panzer Division with what they had, but they could do what they had been doing since winter first struck them: delay, resist, survive. One more minute, one more kilometer, a platoon still breathing and fighting. And so, with ammunition almost gone, men trembling with cold and fear, and the enemy growing before them like a wall, they decided to improvise a last defense. Not an organized line, but a succession of small points of friction. 2 machine guns in a ruined house, a platoon ambushed behind a ravine, grenades buried under the snow. Every meter of ground would be paid for with blood and time. They didn't know if reinforcements would arrive. They didn't know if Bastogne would fall that same day. They didn't even know if they would see the sun the next day. But they knew that there, on that frozen road that snaked through the Ardennes, they wouldn't give anyone free passage. And that certainty, so simple, so human, and so fragile, would be enough to bend fate for a few more hours. The snow began to fall more heavily, thickening the silence between shots. It was as if winter had decided to fight alongside the Germans, erasing tracks, stifling sounds, and covering the landscape with a thick blanket that made every step difficult. The cold was so intense that sensation in the fingers disappeared even before the frozen metal of the weapon was grasped. Some soldiers had to open their gloves with their teeth as their hands no longer obeyed them. The general, who was leading the retreat as promised, observed the scene and perceived a cruel truth unfolding. They were no longer just retreating in terms of men and machines, but also an invisible force that, if it had no name, could very well be called despair. At every bend in the road, every bump, every clearing, he hoped to spot something that might offer hope. A clear crossing, an intact bridge, reinforcements that were late, but still possible. They never came. The Germans, merciless in their advance, began to employ even bolder infiltration tactics. Soldiers dressed in captured American uniforms, driving seized jeeps, would appear unexpectedly, approaching makeshift outposts with forced smiles and quick waves, only to open fire point-blank seconds later. On the other side, the Americans were forced to frantically interrogate any unfamiliar voice, asking questions that only a native speaker would know the answer to. Often, judgment was made too soon, and lives were lost on the threshold between vulnerability and prudence. The retreat was becoming more dangerous than any advance. There were mines buried under the soft snow, ready to explode at the slightest pressure. German tanks emerged like steel shadows from among twisted trees, firing without warning. There were Belgian families, displaced and terrified, appearing at the roadside begging for help that the soldiers were unable to provide. It was a march through a white hell in which north, south, victory and defeat lost all meaning. Even so, small acts of humanity persisted. A soldier sharing a single match to light frozen cigarettes, another pushing his comrade who could barely walk. A sergeant who, without saying a word, shared his last chocolate bar with an entire group. as if that could deceive the hunger that had been silently growing in empty stomachs. And seeing these gestures, the general wondered if this was what truly kept men standing during a war. Not orders, not flags, but the simple inability to abandon a brother. When night finally descended upon the forest and the wind picked up, howling through the skeletal treetops like an ancient warning, what remained of the units managed to reach a modest elevation, a small hill beside the road. There was no fortification there, no real tactical advantage, just frozen earth and a few protruding rocks. But it was the highest point for miles, and at that moment it looked like a castle. There, they decided to stop, not to retreat any further, not to flee, as some would later insinuate in ignorant accounts, just to halt the advance until their bodies could endure no more. Men dug shallow trenches, with bayonets, ration cans, and even pots. Others huddled behind thick trees, creating improvised firing lines. The remaining artillery was positioned at impossible angles because there was neither space nor time to correct anything. The general walked among his men, placing a heavy hand on each one's shoulder, repeating phrases he perhaps didn't believe, but which needed to be said. The night seemed to stretch to infinity when the first shot rang out from the valley. The Germans had arrived. The first shot echoed like muffled thunder coming from the shadows at the foot of the hill. In the next instant, the whole world seemed to explode in red, yellow, and orange lights. The Germans advanced in waves, moving through the snow like shadowy puppets, guided by a silent fury. They didn't shout orders. They didn't waste ammunition. They just came, attentive, calculated, confident that this would be the final blow. Up above, the Americans took a deep breath and pulled the triggers. Rifles trembled in their hands, automatics stuttered with cold and mud, but the first volley of shots found its targets. Men tumbled in the snow, their dark uniforms tearing the whiteness in grotesque stains. The hill, moments before silent, was ablaze with life and death, a mixture of courage, fear, and deafening noise. The wind blew fiercely, spreading smoke that stung the eyes. Visibility was poor, but the senses were amplified. Each explosion seemed to happen inside the chest. Shrapnel cut through, the air like invisible swarms. The Germans responded with machine gun fire that ripped entire chunks from trees, turning trunks into sticks and shelter into danger. The Americans knew they couldn't retreat any further. This was the limit. This was where they had decided they would turn the snow red before giving up another meter of ground. Men took turns in their positions, one pushing the other back to the ground when exhaustion threatened to overcome him. Blood trickled from the ears of those who were too close to grenades. Purple fingers froze on the trigger. Groans mingled with the whistling of the wind, turning the night into a brutal and desperate chorus. The general was on the front line, his body pressed against a rock that barely offered him protection. He fired, reloaded, and fired again, and when his rifle jammed, he simply picked up a fallen soldier's weapon and continued. There were no privileges, no distant command. He bled like everyone else and fought as if he knew that. If he fell, the entire line would collapse with him. As the battle progressed, the terrain around the hill began to resemble a nightmare. Clearings that had once been smooth were now riddled with smoking craters. The snow, once so white and cold, took on the dark, warm hue of blood. And the cold, that cruel companion that had accompanied the retreat, now seemed to observe in silence. It offered no help. It merely watched, indifferent, the insane spectacle that humanity insisted on repeating. When yet another German assault was repelled by sheer sweat, gunpowder, and sheer stubbornness, the night was far from over. But at that moment, amidst spaced-out shots and gasping breaths, the Americans realized that their end would not be quick. This would not be a short fight. That hill, insignificant on the map, had become an altar where each would offer what they had: strength, blood, or their own life. And the snow, inevitably, continued to fall. As dawn approached, the battle ceased to resemble a clash between armies. and began to take on something almost primitive, a fight for survival where the will to stay alive was worth more than any order, flag, or strategic map. The terrain around the hill was deformed, sliced by artillery fire, speckled with motionless bodies that looked like abandoned mannequins on a torn and dirty white sheet. The snow, which should have brought silence, now muffled the screams just enough to make them all the more terrible. Wounded men tried to crawl back to the American lines, leaving red trails that quickly disappeared beneath the icy veil. Men cried out for help, and often those who came to carry them could barely stay on their feet, stumbling over craters, corpses and roots exposed like bones from the earth. Some soldiers fired blindly, aiming only at the noise, at the silhouette that moved too fast among shattered trees. Others, with ammunition running low, resorted to bayonets, knives, shovels. The combat was so close that the vapor of their breath mingled with that of the enemy. Punches, elbow strikes, teeth grinding beneath battered helmets. Hot blood ran down their hands and froze seconds later, turning fingers into stiff forks, almost incapable of holding anything. The American machine guns, positioned at improbable angles, continued spitting out shots until their barrels became so hot that they cracked from the shock of the extreme cold. At each forced pause, the operators rubbed snow on the metal, a desperate act that might save the weapon, but would freeze their own hands and faces even further. It was a choice between feeling pain now or dying later. The air was thick with gunpowder. Each breath carried a metallic taste, almost like dissolved blood. Vision was often blurred by smoke, but the smell never deceived. Gunpowder, sweat, oil, fear, and death. And even with all that, no one retreated. There was nowhere to go. Behind them lay forests, narrow trails, bombed-out bridges, and infiltrated enemies. Ahead, the endless attack. In the midst of this chaos, strange, almost surreal moments emerged. A wounded German fell within the American line and begged for water, and received it. A medic, crouched amidst the crossfire, stitched up a lacerated arm while the world exploded around him. An unarmed chaplain dragged 3 men behind a huge rock and murmured words that no one really heard, but which seemed to keep those soldiers clinging to their last thread of strength. The general, covered in snow and blood he didn't know whose it was, kept moving across the hilltop, encouraging each line, pushing each man forward. That height meant nothing on the map, but at that moment it was all that stood between them and collapse. Every minute held, there was another minute gained for the world outside to breathe. Distant cities, people sleeping in beds, people who would never know the price paid on that frozen ground. And the clock ticked slowly, so slowly that the night seemed eternal. But no one gave up. The battle didn't cease. And on that hill, lost in the Ardennes, the white of the snow continued to turn red, layer after layer, as if winter itself had been forcibly painted. When the first faint rays of light appeared on the horizon, no man celebrated. Dawn did not come as a promise of life, but as a cruel mirror that revealed the true extent of the previous night's horror. The grey light trickled down the hill, dissolving shadows and exposing the terrain as if someone were tearing away a dark cloth that concealed a grotesque work. The ground was littered with debris, pieces of wood, crushed helmets, torn backpacks, weapons twisted by fire and ice. But what drew the most attention were not the objects, they were the bodies. Some were still breathing, moaning softly. Others lay motionless in strange poses, frozen in mid-movement, their last second of life interrupted. And many seemed merely to be sleeping, were it not for the purplish color of their skin, the ice covering their eyebrows and lips, and the dark stains that marred the snow. The general descended a section of the slope to check the line. Each step was heavy, almost ritualistic. With each body he encountered, he recognized boots or a uniform, sometimes a face. At times, he had to look away lest the weight crush him completely. These men had marched with him from the beginning, crossed silent villages, endured endless nights, and believed that there was still hope. And now, many would not see the next attack. But there was no time for mourning. The enemy was near. There was no movement in the trees, but every experienced man knew that Germans retreating from an attack didn't disappear. They retreated only to leap again. The morning silence was deceptive, heavy, full of intent. Not even birds could be heard. Either they were hiding or they had fled the human hell that had taken over the forest. Those who survived were gathered together. No one was whole. Some limped, others trembled. Uncontrollably, many wrapped their hands and arms in makeshift bandages woven from torn uniforms. Hunger bit harder than the cold, and even the strongest had empty eyes, the eyes of people who had seen more than they should have seen in so few hours. Still, when the general spoke, heads turned. He didn't promise victory, nor miraculous reinforcements. He simply told the truth, that the fight would continue, that those who had fallen had held that line with their lives, and that now it was up to them, those who remained, not to let that sacrifice be wasted. It wasn't a fiery speech, but a sincere one, and that was enough. Some took a deep breath, adjusted their belts, tested jammed weapons. Others lit a cigarette with hands so shaky that the ember almost fell on the snow. Each, in their own way, prepared for the next tense moment, because everyone knew what dawn meant in war. Time to see the enemy, and time for the enemy to see you. The sun finally broke through the mist, creating treacherous reflections in the ice crystals clinging to the trees. The hills shone as if covered in diamonds, but up close they were merely blood-stained crystals. Ice dyed grain by the price paid during the night. And while the soldiers breathed the icy air, still too weak to feel fear, a sound in the distance began to grow, the deep roar of engines, bourgeois and metallic, with an unavoidable threatening tone. Tanks. The day had only just begun, and the white hell still had much to claim. The sound grew slowly, as if emanating from the very womb of the frozen earth. First a deep, continuous rumble, difficult even to distinguish from the wind. Then came the tremor in the ground, gentle but increasingly firm, making the snow vibrate like thin glass about to crack. Only then did they appear, emerging from among the trees like predators awakening from a deep sleep. The German tanks. Ashy, green, covered in ice and snow piled on the towers and cannon, they seemed like living creatures, molded from steel and fueled by the war itself. Their movement was slow but merciless. Each track crushed the ground, burying small trees, grinding abandoned backpacks, lifeless bodies, and any hope that dared to stand in their way. The soldiers watching from the hilltop felt their stomachs clench. Some muttered short curses. Others remained in absolute silence, as if they could stop the advance simply by staring at it. Behind them came German artillery and infantry, hurried men, protected by the advancing armor, ready to finish the job begun the previous night. It was clear that this would not be a simple assault. It was a crushing attack, a planned assault to sweep away any remaining American resistance from that forgotten patch of forest. The Americans had no tanks there, only a few remaining artillery pieces, old grenades, jammed weapons, and what little courage remained. The general, seeing what was approaching, took a deep breath and made immediate decisions. He ordered the cannons to be pointed not at the men, but directly at the machines. It was a desperate, almost suicidal gesture, but the only possible one. The first American shot echoed like a dry thunderclap. The bullet traced a short line, missed by centimeters, and exploded in a tree trunk, sending snow and timber flying like freezing rain. The second shot, however, hit its mark. It didn't explode the tank, but it struck a track, tearing off heavy plates and leaving the armored vehicle crippled. The vehicle rolled sideways, skidded, and became stuck, smoking silently under the snow. A nervous roar ran through the American soldiers. It wasn't victory, but it was proof that they could still fight. But every hit was paid for with interest. The enemy towers spun almost immediately, tracking the hill as if they had a life of their own. When the first projectile hit the summit, the entire ground trembled. A deafening roar swallowed shallow trenches. Men were thrown back like mannequins, and snow flew in all directions in a white cloud, followed by black smoke. The attack continued. Explosion after explosion, the hill began to crumble. Frozen earth and blood and ice advanced together down the slope. Still, no one abandoned their position. Grenades were launched in the path of the armored vehicles. Snipers searched for the smallest slits of vision in the metal, waiting for any opening. One soldier, in utter desperation, ran with an improvised magnetic mine and threw himself against the hull of a tank. And for an instant the world around him dissolved into a silent flash. The armored vehicle stopped, dead, but the price paid was written in the snow. It was war in its rawest form. Humans against steel, flesh against machinery, courage against the inevitable. And even in the face of that avalanche of destruction, something surprising began to happen. The German advance, so self-assured, began to lose momentum. Tanks maneuvered with difficulty on the slope covered in craters and debris. The infantry had to spread out, vulnerable to crossfire. The hill, mutilated and bleeding, still held firm. The general looked at his men, or what remained of them. He saw exhaustion, he saw fear, but he also saw determination. That silent rage that only appears when someone decides that death can be accepted, but surrender never. From there, he knew the outcome wouldn't be long in coming. But winter, the most constant enemy of all, continued to watch, and still had the last word to say. The attack seemed endless, a chaotic symphony of explosions echoing across the snowy slopes like distant thunder, yet much closer and more lethal. The blasts not only shook the ground, they pushed waves of snow uphill, as if the very air solidified into improvised avalanches. The fine, pulverized snow covered abandoned weapons, swallowed the fresh craters dug by artillery, erased the jagged footprints of fleeing soldiers, and sealed open wounds in the frozen ground, transforming the battlefield into a merciless white carpet that concealed the chaos beneath. The German tanks persisted, roaring with a guttural growl that vibrated in the bones of those who heard it, advancing inch by inch as if Teutonic will itself were entangled in rusty, ice-covered steel chains. Each turn of the tracks crushed frozen branches and hidden rocks, sending shards of frost into the air, while the cannon barrels smoked with the residual heat of recent salvos. But then, out of nowhere, the most treacherous enemy reappeared with renewed fury, the cold. Until that moment, winter had been a subtle ghost, slowly corroding men, nibbling at exposed fingers, stiffening muscles beneath layers of damp uniforms, whispering promises of hypothermia on endless nights. Now it returned as a decisive ally, invisible and brutal, a primal force that respected neither flags nor alliances. The thermometer plummeted suddenly, without warning, as if the sky had decided to punish human arrogance. The clouds closed in a grey and oppressive mantle, blocking any trace of pale sun that dared to filter through the skeletal trees of the forest. A cutting wind swept across the terrain, howling like a hungry wolf, carrying snowflakes that pricked exposed skin like invisible needles. The snow began to fall in an almost absurd volume, not in delicate flakes, but in dense, swirling curtains, sweeping across the battlefield as if to bury everything the sun had recently revealed, obscuring the outlines of trenches and vehicles in a blinding whiteness. The German engines groaned in protest, a hoarse, agonizing sound mingling with the whistling of the wind. Where before they had spewed acrid white smoke, now they exhaled dense, suffocating vapor, condensing in the icy air into clouds that slowly dissipated. Tanks choked, coughing like old smokers, while carburetors froze into solid blocks of ice, cutting off the vital flow of fuel. Armored vehicles that had advanced steadily stalled like animals, slaughtered in the middle of the hunt, their tracks spinning aimlessly on slippery layers of compacted snow. Some tried to maneuver desperately, turning left or right at impossible angles, only to slip on thick layers of newly formed ice, sinking into invisible holes that opened like treacherous traps under their weight. The infantry, which had relied on the relentless pressure of the armored vehicles to clear a path, was left exposed and vulnerable, pushed back by the gale that cut through skin. Like sharp blades, blinded eyes with ice crystals, and turned every breath into a struggle against the thin, biting air. Soldiers stumbled, cursing in hoarse voices, while their rifles slipped from numb hands and their boots sank into puddles that froze instantly around their ankles. High atop the hill, the American soldiers, already almost ghostly, exhausted, their faces hollowed by unkempt beards and eyes sunken from sleepless nights, watched the transformation without fully understanding it at first. They crouched in makeshift foxholes, wrapped in tattered blankets and coats stained with frozen mud, trembling not only from the cold, but from a profound exhaustion that seeped into their bones. They saw the enemy slow down, stop, retreat, not because the gunfire stopped them, though American bullets continued to whiz by sporadically, but because the battlefield itself was revolting against them, as if the earth had a soul and chose sides. Everything that the German machine had in terms of advancement, calculation, and immensity. The Panzer tanks with their menacing silhouettes, the MG-42 machine guns spitting continuous fire, the hand grenades thrown with precision, fled in small measure compared to the impersonal and silent force of winter, that Ardennes winter that did not obey maps drawn in heated rooms, nor generals with gleaming decorations, nor meticulously planned strategies on war chessboards. The general sensed it before anyone else, his instincts honed by years of combat, surviving the chaos, even shivering with cold beneath his soaked uniform, even stained with hardened mud and dried blood clinging to his skin like a second layer. He understood that this was the pivotal moment, the opening that fate offered. He shouted orders in a hoarse, authoritative voice, some repeated ad nauseum to be heard above the choking wind, echoing like a primal roar. Men rose from where they lay, seemingly resurrected from shallow snow tombs, shaking the ice from their shoulders and blinking to ward off the flakes that accumulated on their eyelashes. Gunners repositioned their cannons with trembling hands, adjusting rusty sights and loading projectiles that felt as heavy as lead in their frozen palms. Riflemen raised rifles with fingers that no longer felt, the triggers hard against numb flesh, aiming at distant shadows through the white curtain. It was the last remaining force, a reserve of raw, instinctive determination, but it was enough to turn the tide. The American counterattack was neither pretty nor organized, like in training manuals. It was a dragging, instinctive march, driven by the urgency of survival and accumulated rage. Shots rang out short and precise, each bullet cutting through the air with a dry crack, finding targets in German silhouettes that now seemed like ghosts lost in the blizzard. Grenades exploded amidst retreating German patrols, sending hot shrapnel that contrasted sharply with the cold, spreading muffled screams and the smell of burnt gunpowder. Some tanks, standing still and stiff like abandoned relics, were set ablaze like metallic torches in the snow, the flames licking the frozen steel and illuminating the twilight with a sinister orange glow, while the spilled fuel hissed as it froze. The Germans continued to fight with fierce tenacity, firing bursts of machine gun fire that sliced branches and ricocheted off rocks. But the terrain had turned against them, every step becoming a frozen trap, puddles that turned to slippery ice, slopes that crumbled under heavy footsteps, winds that deflected bullets and blinded vision. And there, in that nameless patch of forest, where the trees bent under the weight of the snow like ancient sentinels, where the ground was now as red as it was white with pools of blood that froze in abstract patterns, where cold and blood mingled to decide the fates of entire nations, the German advance finally died. Not for lack of courage or competence. The enemy soldiers were tough, trained, driven by a fanatical ideology, but because nothing in the world could overcome the deadly combination of determined men, with faces hardened by adversity and hearts beating with stubborn resilience, and a winter that had decided to fall upon them with all its merciless wrath like a living, vengeful entity. Silence came gradually, insinuatingly, as if the world were holding its breath. First, an interval between shots, a brief void where only the crackling of distant campfires and the whisper of the wind could be heard. Then a whole minute in which no shot cut through the air, allowing the echoes to dissipate into the depths of the forest. Little by little, it became clear that the enemy was retreating, disappearing into the frozen shadows from which it had emerged, leaving behind abandoned vehicles and bodies as motionless as ice statues. And then, finally, nothing but the wind, a constant lament that swept across the slopes, carrying snowflakes that danced like restless souls. Those who survived looked around, trying to understand what they had done, their glazed eyes reflecting exhaustion and disbelief. There was no celebration, no noisy euphoria, only silent astonishment, mixed with a deep relief that seeped slowly, like the warmth of a distant fire. They had held the hill, an anonymous elevation that now seemed a living monument to their resistance. They had survived a night and a day that seemed to last centuries, with time dragging on in moments of pure terror and pauses of suffocating tension. They had faced armored vehicles roaring like mechanical beasts, infantry advancing in human waves, and the cold that bit like an invisible predator. And yet they were still there, breathing vapor in the icy air, their pulses racing beneath torn gloves. On the ground, beneath layers of scarlet-tinged snow, lay those who would never rise again, their bodies motionless in poses of interrupted struggle, their open eyes fixed on the grey sky. The general passed among them one last time, his heavy steps sinking into the soft snow, knowing that victory, if such a name could be given to something so costly, had been bought at too high a price. With lives cut short prematurely, dreams interrupted, and distant families who would never know the details of the sacrifice. The battle had ended there, but not the war. There would still be months of relentless fighting, of exhausting marches through muddy roads and dense forests, of blood spilled in rivers, that would freeze and thaw with the seasons. But something had irrevocably changed. A myth had been shattered. The invincibility of the enemy offensive, which had begun with unstoppable force like a human avalanche, had been halted by exhausted men, jammed weapons that reluctantly spat out bullets, and the furious winter that had allied itself with the defenders. And on that day, on that nameless hill, it became clear to everyone, even if no one said it aloud, preferring to keep their thoughts to themselves in shared silences, that the end of the war in Europe had just begun, as if winter had not only won a battle, but sealed the fate of an entire continent. The forest fell silent, but the cold continued to speak. Each tree, each impressive icy hill, seemed to hold the memory of men who fought to their last breath. And while bodies were collected and weapons buried in the snow, something greater became clear to those who still breathed in that frozen field. The war was not over, but that day marked the moment when a giant stumbled. The furious advance of the Wehrmacht had been broken not only by the courage of the soldiers, but by the very climate that chose a side. There, in the Ardennes, far from grand maps and speeches, ordinary men changed the course of history with jammed rifles, exhausted courage, and the strength that only despair gives. And the whole world would feel the impact of that instant when winter conquered steel and the impossible finally began to crumble.